In January of 1959, Fidel Castro overthrows the then current president of Cuba, Fulgencio Batista. As tensions grew between the U.S. and Cuba in the aftermath of Castro's rise to power, the U.S. began limiting trade relations, while Cuba began nationalizing U.S.-owned properties. Castro's rise to power in Cuba triggered a chain of events that, over the course of the next 50 years, would devastate the Cuban economy. When former President Kennedy ordered a strike from the CIA to overthrow Castro that ultimately failed, trade relations were cut entirely. From the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 to the reopening of commercial travel to Cuba for U.S. citizens in 2016, the fluctuation of Cuban relations changes as different presidents come into power. Some, like President Carter, seek to reopen relations with Cuba, whereas others, like President Reagan, attempt to strengthen the travel ban. A political activist named Jack E. Robinson proposed a deal on behalf of Cuban citizens. The deal he proposed would give Cuban citizens the chance to vote for Cuba to be annexed into the United States while being aided by the U.S. The United States' end of Robinson's deal would be to completely lift the 58-year-long embargo against Cuba and to loan the nation $750 billion to compensate for the revenue lost during the embargo. Cuba's end would be to decide its own fate. They would hold a free election to decide if they become a state, commonwealth, or remain independent with a free market economy. They would also be required to release all political prisoners that they currently hold. However, there are several reasons why this deal wouldn't work. One of the biggest arguments against Cuba becoming a state is the embargo. America isn't even willing to trade with this nation, so the U.S. as a whole would need to take enormous steps towards rebuilding trust in Cuba in order to even consider its annexation. Trust is key, and the U.S. has none for Cuba. While the lift of the travel ban and former President Obama's sit-down with Raul Castro certainly aided efforts to restore relations with Cuba, the embargo has yet to be lifted. 50 years of economic damage cannot simply be undone nor forgotten by the Cuban people. Many with similar mindsets to Jackie Robinson will expect compensation for the fall of the Cuban economy. Many Americans would be outraged at the fact that the Cuban government would dare to demand compensation for the effects of trade restrictions the U.S. implemented as a form of protection against a nearly communist country with well-known history with the Soviet Union. Another issue that has stood time and time against Cuban relations is the President of the United States. While some presidents that have held office seek to reestablish ties with Cuba, most that have been elected continue to strengthen the ban against Cuba, implementing laws like the Helms-Burton Act to further their agenda. There is no telling if the next candidate elected into office will want to regain relations or strengthen the ban and embargo further. Out of all of the presidents that have dealt with this ongoing conflict, the ones who have inflicted the most damage would be Eisenhower and Kennedy. Eisenhower ordered the CIA to train Cuban refugees for the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion. It ended in the refugees being captured or killed, and the Castros cemented their control over Cuba. Kennedy was the one who fully implemented the embargo after sending a squad of fully trained CIA operatives to assassinate Castro. The attack was a massive failure and only served to push Cuba more towards a communist future. While politics serve as the main reason for the rift between two nations, economy plays a large role as well. The economic downfall of Cuba as a result of the embargo is not the U.S.'s cross to bear. With the debt America is already in, it doesn't need to add another $750 billion problem to it. Cuba's economy has been improving under Raul Castro's rule, but it still struggles with flow of money.
Cuba's fundamental economic problem is a lack of productivity, particularly from a bloated public sector. To this end, reforms have sought to shed jobs from public roles, shifting them to an inchoate private sector.
The reforms have created significant leeway for private enterprise. Here in the countryside, that can translate to more options to what is cultivated and who it's sold to.
Hay un mercado en Viñales que tú puedes, si tú quieres vender lo tuyo, tú vas, lo llevas a Viñales y lo puedes vender en el mercado.
Tú le das el por ciento al gobierno y después la que tú te quedaste con ella, esa te la paga un poco más alto que el otro.
Y eso es algo nuevo que no existía hace un par de años.
Eso es nuevo.
¿Y el pueblo está feliz con esos cambios?
Sí, sí.
More recently, self-employed entrepreneurs or cuentapropistas have created opportunities in the cities.
Here in the urban centers, there are hundreds of opportunities for private enterprise and non-agricultural co-ops, from the tire repairs to the barber shops to the local souvenir shops.
Ricardo de Urrutia is a private tour guide, top-rated on TripAdvisor.
Does the government ever mess with your business?
No, because everybody's paying taxes, so why would they? They're making good money too.
But with the 21st century economy comes 21st century problems. Some fear that inequality in Cuba is on the rise.
A key concern with the reforms is that not all Cubans can take advantage of them.
Microcredit is limited, and for those without access to remittances or tourist dollars, putting together the startup capital for a private business is difficult. Magia and Alaxe, the legendary Cuban hip-hop duo Obsesión, talk about how this could affect the Afro-Cuban community.
Que obvio no le permite a esta población acceder a esos cambios de manera así como pudiera ser otras que han recibido remesas porque tienen familiares afuera y hoy pueden iniciar un negocio porque hay que tener presupuesto para eso.
Yo creo que los cubanos estamos conscientes que salvar la economía del país implica una cuota de desigualdad inevitable, ¿no? Ahora, el Estado cubano necesita crear mecanismos que amparen a las personas que están en una posición frágil en la sociedad. Y ahora mismo todavía no veo a las claras cuál es el plan.